The ninth applied precept. I bear witness to the reality of my own ill will and the pain of divisiveness in the world, and aspire to respond with care when difficult situations and emotions arise. Traditionally, do not be angry, or do not hold on to anger. Why do I get angry? Our traditional image of a Buddhist is of someone who never experiences anger, who remains always cheerful and smiling, and perhaps it's the fantasy that this person could turn out to be me that's part of Zen's attraction for us. But rather than being my enemy, could we think anger as my true friend? The traditional wording of this precept seems to suggest it as an enemy. Do not be angry, and if you do, then let it go. Our ordinary mind phrasing links ill will and divisiveness. Anger can separate us from each other and also within ourselves. Anger offers us a sense of self, purpose and identity. Anger takes the grey out of the picture, removing all nuance and refinement. It's always in stark black and white, them and us. We experience ourselves as separate from each other, and yet this separation is also a binding together. It's you or them that made me angry, and with that anger and that blame I both push you away and hold you tight to me. No wonder it both exhilarates and hurts. If we can bear with this experience and not try to drive it out or push it inwards, then we'll come to understand better what it is to be a self in this world, and so be less separate. So while anger is always a call to action, if instead we resist that call and allow ourselves simply to experience our anger, then it can indeed become our teacher. Heat and cold. Some people I've met, including many of those I've met in prison, would like to limit what counts as anger to the red mist kind, a blind and hormonally driven rage that makes us unaware of anything outside itself and demands acting out right here and right now, whether that's just my shouting at you or actual physical violence. Of course, I probably won't acknowledge this sense in which I both enjoy being angry and feel validated by it, even if, as we'll discuss below, my feeling anger may well be followed by feelings of shame. Hot anger burns. As I become angered, I feel the rush of emotion and the accompanying rush of blood. The entire balance of my hormone shifts. Adrenaline is secreted, and while some of my sensations are heightened, others are suppressed, exactly as with drink, drugs, or any of the intoxicants we discussed in relation to the fifth precept. The call to action is real, and it's deeply physical. Those tense muscles demand release, demand action. So this kind of anger calls for immediate expression, which is literally taking something from inside and pushing it out of me. I might lash out or shout out, push you back with my hands or the force of my words. I'll feel huge release in this moment, a triumphant sense of my own reality, although this will probably be short-lived and shame or regret may well arise in response. If I don't or can't act this out, get it out of me, don't express it, I will suffer. The tension in my muscles, the pounding in my head, the knot in my stomach, and the feeling of frustration that may border on desperation. I need to act, I must act, but I'm prevented. The heightened and partial sense of self that anger has given me may well collapse if I don't keep feeding it with self-justification, reciting the crimes of my perceived aggressor and the wrongs I feel I am suffering. However it plays, it's important to understand that the function, the purpose of all of this is in reality to evade my feelings of anger. And that this is true whether I punch you in the face, bang my own head against the wall, or collapse into a spiral of shame. Much of what I probably think of as too trivial to label to anger fits this same basic pattern as well. The sudden irritation that draws me up sharp, or to which I have responded with an unkind word before I'm even aware of it. Do I choose to spit it out or swallow it down? Either way, I want rid. This is all the anger referred to in Do Not Be Angry. But what of cool anger, which the term ill will perhaps fits better? No adrenaline rush, no spasms of pain or cramp, no burning in my muscles that demands release. Ill will is altogether slower and more considered, and if I do notice it in my body, it's more likely as a diffuse tension. It lives as resentment or the plotted revenge, the pleasure in an enemy's discomforting. It emerges after the event, whether I actually expressed anger at the time or not. It uses the same pattern of rumination, but rather than being an immediate, acute response to the situation, it becomes chronic, acting over time. So becoming more of a mindset, a predisposition, a worldview. It's anger that's quiescent, seemingly passive, but which contains the constant possibility for finding the cutting remark, the shared put down. It puts a more subtle tension in my body, hardening both my muscles and my thinking. We all probably have this to some degree, and much of the time maybe barely aware it's there. Do I ever find myself speaking more sharply than I'd intended, being snarky, snapping at someone who just happened to be there? Do I find myself unintentionally coming back in my thoughts over and over again to the same annoyance or felt injustice? Do I find myself endlessly justifying my own actions to myself, or find that I can't help doing so to other people? This process is circular. It's not that I have a certain wrong view of myself as causing my anger. Rather that the anger I feel is itself forming this aspect of self continuously, a self defined as separate and in opposition to other selves. Ill will is less exciting than hot anger, and can rarely find more than a momentary and partial release, although it may at any moment reignite as rage. The real danger is that the more thoroughly and unconsciously we experience it, the more it can come to frame the world as a whole for us. Many years ago I read an interview with the celebrated American writer Gore Vidal. This isn't an exact quote, but it lodged in me as a paradigm of ill will. Every time I hear about the success of one of my friends, a little something in me dies. This is the mind of ill will. It's the mind of suspicion, of reactivity, of myself and that of all others, formed in permanent opposition and struggle. Note again that ill will both separates me from you, but it also binds me to you. You're in my thoughts and in the bones and sinews of my body, the object of my preoccupation. But note also that just as with the violent expression of rage, what I'm really still doing here is avoiding the actual direct experiencing of my anger as it shows up in my body. Instead, I'm separating off from it, holding it at a safe, or at least a copable distance. It may sour our relationship and even sour my life, but at least I don't have to truly engage with it. This is the anger referred to in Do Not Hold On to Anger. All this may well sound paradoxical, so am I performing some verbal sleight of hand here? I feel angry. So what do you mean I'm not experiencing it? Well, what I'm trying to point to is that we feel anger when our sense of self appears to be threatened, and that this anger is always a call to action, to do something, to allow it to discharge. Holding this anger focuses and strengthens our threatened sense of separate self through preparing for action. The adrenaline, the racing thoughts, the muscles tensed. I am going to show you, or them, that I cannot be messed with. But my focus is outwards, directed onto the object I've found for my anger, you. Holding this anger is exciting but also painful. I need to express it, act it out, get rid of it. And while I'm doing this, I'm not really experiencing it at all. To experience our anger requires that we don't act it out or act it in, that we don't evade or dissociate from it. Easier said than done, but if we can do this, then our practicing with anger becomes purposeful and enlightening. I'm no longer trying to make it go away or to be always calm, and how's that working out for you? Instead, I can come to investigate it thoroughly and so change my relationship with anger. Practice question. How far am I aware of my own hot anger and how I express it? How far am I aware of my own cool ill will and how I express that? Practicing with anger. As always, Diane Rossetto offers us a detailed way into our practice with this precept as a non-judgmental investigation of our experiencing of anger. She says, become curious about what triggers your anger as you go about your daily activities. What events set anger in motion for you? Someone cuts you off on the freeway. There's a moment of madness and you make a rude gesture. You know there's nothing positive or helpful about your reaction, but you get some sense of satisfaction momentarily. It'll take a while, but if you have the intention to be open and observant, you'll begin to pick up on what thoughts are present when the energy rises. At first, in all likelihood, several things will happen. First, you won't remember to turn the mind towards the inquiry until after the event. Then you will judge it. I shouldn't be thinking that way, or I did it again, or I'll never get over this. You may also find that thoughts develop into a story about who did what and so forth. If this happens, when you finally notice you've been off into a story, which can take seconds or minutes or hours, just make a mental note of the thought by repeating it. Having a thought that. By keeping the intention to not try to solve anything, but to allow awareness of what type of thinking triggers anger reactions, you'll begin to experience a little space in which your awareness can deepen, so that your experience resonates and speaks. Your particular pattern of thinking and feeling around anger will emerge. Be patient. You can't recognize years of collected requirements in just a few exercises. As before, Diane used that insightful but double-edged term, requirements. What do I feel I need or demand right here? What is it that I'm not being respected? Or is the requirement simply respect, recognition itself? Having requirements sounds bad and not very Buddhist. What our requirements actually show us are the specific aspects of how we come to be and act as the self we are in each moment, our selfing. So, from the perspective of the way some Zenists talk, the self is unreal, just to be a no self. Our requirements clearly are only a hindrance. However, from our perspective of becoming aware of this process of our selfing, they simply invite further investigation. And so, beyond the generic idea of a unified good or bad self, I can investigate why this requirement and to what particular aspects of myself, my identities as they relate to my socially constructed fantasies of how it should be for me, to what does this connect? To do this, I have to learn to listen to my experiencing. To do this at all well, I have to listen differently to the stories of separation and judgment that I tell myself. Stories that influence the quality of this selfing. I have to begin to hear these as stories, as the defensive justifications they are, and not as descriptions of fact or objective truth. So often with these stories, we reach instinctively towards the binary inequalities of hierarchy, domination, and shaming to reinforce our sense of mutual otherness, of our non-relationship with the object of our anger. We define who we are by opposing it to what we think we are not. In terms of my anger, I'm neither black nor white until there's somebody else to insist on or to challenge the privilege that whiteness brings. And the same goes for every other dualistic difference. Looking for defensive separation, we find it ready to hand in the differences on which inequality is founded. The stories we tell ourselves about what we are not are too often those where we feel we've been injured and angered, and hence ill will and anger as the emotions that seem most to divide us off from each other, make us appear to ourselves as truly separate selves. We do this by ruminating on the injury we see as having been done to us, and so setting up circular thought patterns that only increase our anger and ill will, strengthening our sense of having an identity that's different from the others, and of being someone with a story to tell, and hence of being real. The traditional Buddhist term for this is prapancha, the way we use our repetitive self-stories almost as a mantra to fabricate and make solid the illusion of separation, to hold our anger at a safe distance from ourselves. Practice question. Can I begin to recognize my requirement when I get angry? Can I become aware of my circling thoughts as prapancha? Opening to anger. Can I own up to all this in myself? Can I open to it all? Can I hold even my thoughts of self-judgment without finding myself carried away by them into either self-justification or self-reproach? Diane says, once you more frequently notice your reactions, it's important to allow their presence in open awareness. So if judgmental thoughts arise, you can just repeat them to yourself and move on. Having a thought that I'm still getting angry over, or I don't feel anything and I should. Sometimes people will say that they know they're angry but don't have a feeling in their body. We don't want to experience the fear that underlies our anger. And so outside the buzz of acted out or imagined expression, we don't want to own the anger itself. Most likely our anger has already been displaced anyway from its initial source as fear, and in a way it's still fear, but now transformed into the need to act, to do. Which is why we refuse our experiencing of anger by expressing it, pushing it out, or displacing it into shame, or back onto fear. Fear of my expressing it, fear of the other's response. It won't help if I'm just not used to connecting up my feelings, my emotions, with my feelings, my bodily sensations. But we all dissociate like this to some degree. Maybe I'm not even used to connecting my thoughts to my emotions. Actually, that's probably all of us too. Have you ever been challenged, hey, you seem really angry, only to thunder in response, I am not angry? And perhaps I do think that I never get angry. What if I really believe I don't get angry, that I never experience anger? Well, the chances are that I've learnt to suppress my conscious anger by channeling it into ill will, where I can banish it from my awareness, though not from having its effect on how I act. Many families make it perfectly clear to their children that anger is not an acceptable emotion and that it must never be displayed, but instead be hidden, swallowed down, and ideally repressed. Within the family, this is a strategy of control, of power, that minimizes any challenge to those holding authority. Of course, this is often a strategy our parents learnt from their parents and that they may not even be consciously aware of. It's simply unthinkable that one would display anger and contrary to one's core received values. So I might think I'm bad if I get angry. I might have been implicitly or explicitly told that I appear to be bad, ungrateful, lower class, a sinner, or even mentally ill if I display anger. To be good, I make sure I never feel any anger, or at least not show any anger, and from there become able to not be aware of the anger I'm feeling. I might divert my feelings of anger onto my sense of injury. I'm not angry, I'm just sad. Or I might even try to repress that feeling too. Perhaps I learned as a child never to be bad by being angry and became so good that I never appeared to be angry at all and never consciously feel it. It may not even feel safe to experience my own anger, either because I think my anger may hurt or even destroy me, or that it might provoke other people into harming me. If my carers or my peers appear frightened by anger, whether their own or other people's, then this becomes even more likely. So by whatever route I've come to the idea, I may well feel that I shouldn't get angry, and that if I do, then it's wrong and skillful. So I have a perfect motive for either persuading myself that I'm not angry when in fact I am, or thinking that I'm really bad for feeling anger. These kind of reactions and thought patterns easily transform into shame. There's a link here too to the way Diane's students examine their requirements in their examination of their own beliefs about anger. Diane. The belief then is that it's destructive in some way. Student. Yeah, the belief is anger is always destructive. Another student. If I were a better person, I'd have some better way of dealing with this situation than getting angry about it. Diane. So what's wrong with anger? What's the belief? Student. It's a sign that there is something else wrong, that I have bad coping skills or something. Then anger shows that I'm a failure. Diane. If the belief is that anger can hurt people, are you included in that hurt? Student. What I'm really afraid of is that it will show my weakness. Diane. It will show weakness. Yes, that is the belief we've been circling around as it comes into the light. Anger will reveal my weakness. Our sense of weakness is itself shaming, and to connect this to our anger is to place us in a tight double bind. At one level, my anger is an assertion of my strength. But the fear underlying that anger is shaming, because this fear is in itself always an acknowledgement of a potential lack of control, of weakness. The angrier I get, the greater the potential for shame. It's a delicate balance. The experience of shame is itself shaming. That's the shame spiral, which may either cause my anger to collapse or on the contrary, to increase into blind rage. None of this will help me become better aware of my anger or learn to work with it. None is in any way helpful or will let me address the reality of my anger, the reality of my own life as it is. Practice question. Do I really believe I never get angry? Do I get angry and feel bad about it? Or self-righteously insist on my right to feel angry? I am not angry, but I mentioned our stereotype of the good Buddhist earlier, and you might well have noticed a parallel there with what we've just been looking at. Buddhists are never angry, but instead are always happy and smiling. They never experience negative emotions. Or at least this is what many people, including many Buddhists and perhaps ourselves, think is the way Buddhists should be. Note the should. So if I've already picked up the idea that anger is bad, then my Buddhist identity and beliefs will reinforce it, even if I want to substitute unskillful for bad. I now have a further motive for hiding my anger from myself and from those around me. I retreat from the reality of my anger into a world of goodness, but one into which my ill will is in constant danger of breaking through. I remember a Dharma talk by Martine Batchelor about her own experience living in a community of passive-aggressive Buddhists. Superficially, all smiles and goodwill, but ill will constantly breaking through in their fault-finding and sniping at each other. Who washes out their cup and who doesn't? Anything could and did become an opportunity for the display of injured and resentful virtue. All this just isn't discussed nearly enough. Joko Beck also talks about this traditional Zen approach to anger. When anger arises, much of the traditional Zen practice would have us blot out the anger and concentrate on something, such as the breath. Though we've pushed the anger aside, it will return whenever we're criticized or threatened in some way. In contrast, our practice is to become the anger itself, to experience it fully without separation or rejection. Many of us have experienced coming back from a sesshin or just a particularly peaceful meditation session, feeling nothing but interconnection with all beings, only to be dragged back to a very separate self-awareness by the pettiest of problems or disagreements. This is because in my sitting I make myself open and vulnerable, and so the slightest perceived challenge may launch a defensive response, the more so when I'm feeling closer to that fantasized state of inner peace. What is the alternative to this? Well, as Joko suggests, simply experiencing my life as it is, the reality of my anger as it is, without covering it over or hiding from it. Experiencing my anger as it arises and the suffering it brings. Of course, perhaps simply is not so simple. There's no point pretending I'm not angry or exhorting myself not to be. There's no point pretending it's all okay. My anger is a part of me and it needs acknowledgement and care. It needs experiencing without acting it out on someone. And that includes acting it out on myself. If I don't judge myself for feeling angry, don't think I'm bad for feeling angry, that I shouldn't feel this way, then I can be honest with myself about how I actually do feel and observe my anger and take care of it as a part of myself. But this could be hard work. Back to Diane Risotto. The important point, practicing with habitual patterns of mind and body, is to allow an open inquiry into their workings. We must explore anger events in all their forms, whether it's a simmering upset or a full-blown harangue. We slowly learn to face it and embrace it. We come to know its face intimately, invite it in and call it by its true name. This can seem very frightening. It's difficult to do when we're in the heat of it. We move slowly. Be patient, just opening, inviting. What naturally wants to reveal itself will come to the surface in time. You may begin to notice that tightening in certain areas of the body, or breath holding is subtly associated with certain emotions or thoughts, such as frustration or jealousy. Try to relax and rest in the experience of just this. In time, you will notice that whatever you experience is just a passing wave of energy. The key is to allow. Don't try to change it, manipulate it, or get rid of it. Practice question. Can I connect, become my anger without being consumed by it? The problem with anger. But letting off a little steam, clearing the air, where's the harm in that? And what about the anger that fuels our struggles to overcome obstacles and right wrongs? Against the grain of more traditional Buddhist approaches that would seem to ask us to struggle wholly to banish our anger, it's now often asked whether our anger and ill will really do any harm. Contemporary Zen, drawing on both serious therapeutic practice and pop psychology, can show a more tolerant, even positive attitude towards anger. It's admitted that this precept shows us how we strengthen our self-identity and delusion through anger, but let's not delude ourselves about living in the midst of delusion and that we are not going to escape anytime soon. In answer, it's worth pointing out that different contemporary Zen teachers take different lines here. The variety of phrasings of the precept reflect this. It's worth looking at the different orientations of these different versions. Do not be angry suggests that, as it deludes and blinds us, anger in any of its forms is best avoided. Do not hold on to anger supposes that it's more the mindset of ill will that's the real issue, that a clean burn of anger lived in the moment is no problem. It's the residue and rumination left when it doesn't burn out that's the damaging part. It's also argued that justified or righteous anger is a positive emotion, as we can use the great energy that anger gives us in a good and unselfish cause. Dain Rossetto makes this distinction in an interesting, but I think nevertheless problematic way, between what she calls self-centered and life-centered anger. The key is to really know whether the anger motivates action that benefit the well-being of ourselves or others, or if it motivates actions that are hurtful to ourselves or others. One action we can say is life-centered, the other action we can call self-indulgent. Life-centered anger has the power to be open and transformative. It rises and falls quickly and is never held on to. This is the clean burn view, and we are offered a classic anecdote about Joko Beck herself in support. The 75-year-old Zen teacher is walking on the beach when she sees two young men fighting furiously. Feeling the sudden burn of anger, she rushes over and, pushing them apart, yells, "Stop it!" which they duly do. For her student, Diane, this is skillful action that responds to circumstances. Now, happily, it turned out well, but how would we tell the story if a misaimed punch had instead ended the life of this unwelcome interloper? I think there are problems too in how she uses her other examples. I'll look at just one. The Mothers Against Drunk Drivers campaign group, founded in response to the rage and pain of mothers whose children had been killed on the roads. This group is indeed a wonderful example of a life-centered response to such a devastating loss and to the overwhelming and complex feelings it would inevitably bring up. But response is the key word here. My reaction would probably run more to wanting the individual that took the life of my child to be cruelly tortured and killed by the state, or my hunting them down myself. Founding a non-profit organisation engaging in wide-ranging support and educational work is exactly going beyond rage, to allow the fear and pain to begin to resolve through empathy for others and practical, appropriate action. It's certainly life-centred, because instead of acting out to express and hence evade that anger, it engages with it, allows it, and connects it in awareness to the fear and pain which lie underneath it. This is anything but a clean burn, quickly rising and falling. It's the itself painful, ongoing work of holding the experiencing of anger as it continues to continue, decade after decade. The point here is connecting my pain, my anger, up to that of others, and so theirs to mine, as a way of affirming the mutuality of relationship, a non-separation that releases us from the separation of fear and anger. Thich Nhat Hanh always spoke of it as not being enough to want peace, or even to fight for peace. We have to be peace. This is the potential trap in every fight against injustice, and one we all too easily fall into, not through our badness or stupidity, but exactly because this injustice is here in front of us, and it genuinely is wrong, and it needs to be stopped, and now. This isn't to make the political point that the bad faith of our opponents will inevitably cast us as extremists, troublemakers, even a mob, terrorists, insofar as we make ourselves separate by wanting a clear distinction between their wrong and our right. We just amplify the problem. What are my chances of meeting you with openness and possibility when I'm burning with anger at you? And if I can't, then what are my chances of being understood? In my self-justification, can I really stand so detached that I will not be speaking of my own superiority and denigrating you? Now, how will you respond in that case? So we need to consider the 4th, 6th and 7th precepts, and we can also recognize anger as one of the forms of intoxication that relates to the 5th precept, in the clouding of our judgment, in the rush of blood and adrenaline. How can I judge well in that condition? Can we ever really communicate without finding a genuine openness and equality? So how do we bear witness to our anger when it's structural or personal injustices that provoke it? How do we speak our truth? There is no magic formula, but I'll offer an example. This was in the context of a discussion about the Church of England's latest misstep in its bungled attempt to come to terms with the decades-long cover-up of sexual abuse carried out by its clergy. A representative of a group of those who'd been abused spoke, not of the abuse itself, but of their feelings in response to having been initially vilified, and despite the ponderous bulk of an administrative machine called into being to examine the problem, having since then just been largely ignored. Even when they had finally been listened to, even when the truth of their cases had been acknowledged, there was still no sense that they were ever really recognised, that their human suffering, ongoing in its consequences, had been put at the centre of the inquiry. He spoke with an intensity that was overwhelming, and overwhelming because it held an infinite but controlled rage in balanced tension, with an equal sadness that bordered on despair at the seeming impossibility of their ever gaining true recognition as human beings, of the damage that had been done to them and the further damage still being done in withholding the recognition that might offer at least some step towards healing. It was both an accusation and a plea for help, a plea he expected to fall on well-intentioned but ultimately deaf ears. He kept his voice under control, just. You could not hear him without feeling anger, outrage, deep sadness, and yes, despair. I felt his pain. Practice question. When have I truly spoken my truth to another? And when has another spoken their truth to me? Could I hear that truth? Anger is relationship. So let's ask again. Why am I angry now, here in this present moment? Why do I ever get angry and harbour so much ill will? To start with, I'll probably reply, it's you. You made me angry. by what you did or what you didn't do that you should have. It's your fault I'm angry. But of course, this is actually just a story about my anger. The story I tell about a separate me and a separate you that justifies my anger towards you. I could, of course, instead adopt the classic naive Buddhist attitude and make it all about me. It's myself, my badness, my unskillfulness, my karma. Both of these approaches deny our actual relationship through anger. We are paradoxically tied together by our separation from each other. And we are both tied to the world outside our relationship also. Whether this is the first time we've met or whether we've spent our lives together, neither of us came here today empty and immaculate, but instead as complex social beings engaged in the world. So what is it that's really making me angry? So many of the examples we've looked at point clearly towards relationship and its breakdown as being the source of anger. Sometimes these are face-to-face and personal, the choir boy and his priest. Sometimes these are institutional, both institutional and personal. The church authorities and those particular individuals charged with investigating the promises made of resolution, the despair as it fails to materialise, and as those individuals are replaced by others. Sometimes the relationships are more abstract or diffuse. Drunk drivers, our children. For most of us, most of the time, it's more the day-to-day irritations and crises at home or at work, or the passion with which we address an ongoing cause, the climate crisis, child poverty. In all of these, both intimate and distant, what rouses my anger is the sense of the failure of some aspect of a relationship. A failure that poses a threat that's not simply physical, but in some way existential. A threat to my core self of who I really am. Because we're social, relational beings, who I really am is always itself about who we really are, bound up both with some sense of our many identities and with our mutual recognition. So while anger will always be a reaction to fear, that fear is fundamentally of a threat to my relational sense of self. And it's this that will give it the specific quality of anger. I experience my sense of self as being challenged by your implicitly misidentifying me, because you're breaking the lawfulness, as we've had before in Jessica Benjamin's sense, the lawfulness underpinning our real or assumed relationship. So, in your eyes, do I even really exist as the person I think I am? And given our mutual necessity, if I'm not recognised by you, do I really exist at all? How dare you treat me like that? Anger is always relational in a second sense, and importantly so. There is a relative but real difference between the anger I feel at my computer acting up and my experiencing anger at your denial of recognition to me because, say, of the colour of my skin or my presenting as female, or between you stealing my parking space and the letter I get refusing my application for disability benefits. None of this is simply about me or some generic idea of a self I do not think I possess, but about the different actual kinds of relationships in the world's worlding as me living as this person in this society. Because my anger is so often experienced immediately and so intensely and intimately, it offers me a superb opportunity to begin to see the selfing of myself in my relationships, to become aware of this process of my showing up as this me. My anger can actually help me come to begin to experience this absence of any final fixed form or inner essence to myself, and help me experience that I'm much more a process than a fixed or permanent thing. Practice question. Can I begin to own my anger as something co-created and so without blame? What difference does this make to the way I am able to experience it and think about it? The should in anger. Easy to see the extremes of our hot anger as a reaction to a direct threat to my sense of self. Harder, perhaps, to see how pretty much everything we get angry about presents such a threat. But if we shift the emphasis of how I think of this self that I am, from the permanent and isolated separate being of our delusional fantasy, and instead as being the process of a moment-by-moment formation out of our widest sense of relationship, then this will become more apparent. So, if someone's unkind to my child, I'll probably get angry and there's an obvious self-connection there. But if I see pictures of migrants in boats being detained as they reach land, I might well get angry, either at this swarm of invading potential terrorists intent on freeloading while they destroy the fabric of my nation, or at the inhumanity with which we meet the other when they're poor and desperate. In neither case am I apparently directly threatened physically, emotionally, or existentially. But in actual fact there is a subtle existential rupture when viewed relationally. It's not only in our directly meeting each other that Jessica Benjamin's idea of relationship as mutuality grounded in a sense of lawfulness applies. Our general sense of fairness is important to all of us and in all situations, and is an aspect of this idea of lawfulness. Note that this can be applied in either direction in my example, depending on how and where I draw the line of otherness. Either it's not fair that these others take what's ours, or it's not fair that we treat our fellow humans in this way. Because all our relationships are based in mutuality, we can't recognise ourselves except through recognising each other. This sense of lawfulness grounds the possibility of meaningful relationship, and so a challenge to this sense of lawfulness, which we often experience as fairness, is felt as a failure of recognition towards me, and so as a fear-provoking potential existential threat. Where and how are these lines of otherness drawn? How too can we measure the lawfulness or fairness in the competing interests of different beings? Where, between the limits of only I matter and saving all beings, is the line drawn in this moment, in this relationship? And is it drawn in such a way that allows for our mutually necessary relative and reciprocal otherness, or which denies it in the fantasy of an absolute otherness, an absolute separation between you and me, or between us and them? On what grounds do I ask for your recognition, your respect? Simply as another fellow human, or as the possessor of a certain identity defined in opposition to an other? When my self-sense is grounded not in my shared vulnerability, also bearing in mind that I may think you do not share in this shared vulnerability, then when in my eyes you fail to show me recognition, I feel injured. This is very similar to how the whole shaming being shamed cycle works, and of course anger is itself part of that cycle. Often, as we explored with thinking about shame, the actual injury may be minuscule, but the feeling of hurt and anger is huge. So, for the purposes of our practice, I'd suggest that it's this sense of separation from the mutuality of relationship and the fear resulting from the failure of our shared sense of lawfulness or fairness that provokes our anger as an involuntary reflex. Anger always implies a should. They should act in this way, not that. We're back at Joko's story of the rowboat that crashes into mine out on the lake. My anger rises at the unfairness of the rowers' actions. They should have looked out for other boats. They should have had the intention to be paying attention. And then as I suddenly see there was no rower, the boat is empty and merely drifting. My anger collapses. Fairness, lawfulness have not been violated, and so neither has my sense of self. Without this should that underlies our shared sense of lawfulness, our relationship has no guidelines. You might do anything at all. That's frightening, both physically, what might happen, but even more importantly at the level of recognition. Without your recognition, I don't fully exist. And depending on the significance of our relationship, I may feel that without that recognition, I don't really exist at all. How could you do that to me? Important to remember once again that it's not just the extremes of red mist anger that are like this. In their own ways, the minor irritations that cause anger in my day-to-day life are equally involuntary responses to this sense of the failure of relationship. And of course, this is why I may well come to feel the hurt most strongly in the minutiae of my most intimate long-term relationships. The dishwasher not emptied, the offhand remark, the lack of response in the other's eyes. I don't want to feel this way. I don't want to feel this hurt, this fear, and so I push out this feeling and express it by acting out, or push it inwards and dissociate from it or repress it. In neither case am I willing to be with, to bear witness to, and thereby, for this moment, simply to be this anger. Practice question. Can I come to see better the way my sense of self relies on my sense of you? What are the wider issues that come to show up in the day-to-day ruptures in this relationship? The teacher. Are we brave enough to allow ourselves really to feel our pain? Again, this is without judgment because there are so many reasons why we evade it, and frankly many of them good ones. Our own suffering, and particularly our trauma, whether acute or developmental, will render our pain difficult and sometimes impossible to hold. This being with, this coming to be my anger, is always only ever work in progress. The reality of my anger is what I experience when I bring my awareness to it, which means, in this moment at least, not expressing it and so avoiding it. And also not avoiding it by distracting myself or justifying myself. When I stop trying to avoid it and instead can simply be with it, whatever the stories I'm telling myself about what has caused it, then I don't need to separate off from you by blaming you, or from the angry part of myself by blaming me, or by trying to hide what I actually feel. How then might we best think of and work with the anger we all experience? As an enemy to be vanquished? As the shame-filled marker of our weakness, our failure to live up to our fantasized self-image? Better, I think, to see it as part of our life as it is, and so as a teacher, and often a very great one. If we can distinguish carefully between the actual experiencing of our anger and the acting out or acting in that prevents us experience it, anger is, as Diane Rossetto herself emphasizes, a wake-up call. What is this anger showing me about our relationship? About our relationship when seen in its widest sense, beginning with you and me, as we are right here and right now in this moment, but extending outwards to potentially all beings, allowing the stories, the prapancha to settle and still themselves, and to feel into the experience of this anger as it is in this moment, and allowing that the us here may have to include both my experience and experiencing of different parts of myself, and include too the known or faceless representatives through which I engage with the myriad organisations, private or public, with whom I have to deal. To do any of this well, I do have to learn to discipline my reactions into responses. I can always put it as a question. Am I acting out of my anger by responding to its deeper call and its questioning? Or am I acting it out by reactively pushing it away as violent words or actions? I'll emphasise again that acting out, of course, includes the different kinds of acting in, as aggressive thoughts aimed at my sense of self, or as violent actions against my body, or swallowing and suppressing the conscious experience of my anger through dissociation, only for it to show up as depression or in the festering of ill will. Why am I angry? Because I'm suffering. How do I experience this? I can feel it in my body. I am this body. I can experience the tension, the physical tension, the pain of not shouting, not lashing out, not turning my back, not searching for the release of the put down or cutting remark. There's a real demand from my body, a desperate need to act, to turn away from this pain and to do something. I can experience too the cycling of my thoughts, justifying myself at the expense of the other, trying to convince myself I am these thoughts. I can observe the pain of the emotions I'm feeling. I am these emotions. If I stay with these feelings and thoughts, they will shift and change and may open out onto others, leading me deeper into this sense of hurt itself and widening the scope beyond what I wish to see as the immediate trigger of my anger. Practice questions. Can I map in detail the way anger shows up in and as my body? What arguments am I finding to stoke the fire? Do I find myself repeating this internal monologue? How does my anger develop and disperse or discharge? Did I come to my senses? Did I act on it? How? Did I try to bury or push it away? Did I call myself bad or stupid? Don't try to force any of this by analysis. Just sit with the questions and see what happens. Vulnerable. This is my practice in my zazen when anger arises and falls. It can also become my practice whenever I can bring awareness in the moment to the rise of anger and I'm able to take a breath, a mental or physical step back. Sometimes when I'm face to face with you, feeling the confrontation and feeling the anger rise, then taking that step back or breathing in that slow breath, that may be all I can manage. Such simple, physical, embodied actions can still be enough to check my outburst or hostile response. I may even have to hold silence, keep my peace, in order not to fill the space with unwise words. If I do feel I have to leave, and sometimes this really may be the best option, then in doing so my shrug, the way I turn my back to go, may still speak volumes, and wisely or unwisely so. I can at least note my posture, stiff and closed, arms folded, and how this relates to the anger I'm feeling. But how would it be from this position? if I could still open to the other, to you, arms wide, offering not defence but vulnerability, and without any submission on my part, still meeting you undefended with openness and possibility. How would you then respond? Take the unadvised that if someone annoys you, then give them a present. Not to try to change them, not to be kind, but to help me mend my own sense of separation from them. How can we meet the other here in this situation? You and I disagree because one way or another we've broken the implicit sense of lawfulness that has held us in relationship, and so now feel threatened in ourselves. How do we heal that? Of course, one or both of us may really need some space alone right now, but just for now. But if not, our shared sense of lawfulness isn't some legal contract to be rendered null or void if broken, or with specified penalty clauses for failures to comply fully. Our sense of lawfulness is multidimensional and multi-layered, largely implicit and felt within us, and often only articulated in thoughts or speech when we already have the felt sense of its having been broken. From the most basic empathy we can feel for any living thing, the struggling fly or the neglected pot plant, through to the shared sense of being people like us, and so to the absolute specificity of being me and you. Our more important and enduring relationships have resilience precisely because there is always somewhere else to go. Our shared experience, our common goals that make us mutually necessary to each other, not separate. Of course, if my actual safety, physical, emotionally, sexual, is being threatened, then I need to get out of there now as swiftly and safely as possible. But you and I, here and now, can't we get over this? This is patient, long-term work. Learning to recognize anger in all its forms as it reveals itself in the tension in my body, the tone of my voice, the train of my thoughts. Learning to stop, to check, to pause, to breathe into it. Learning to feel and to listen underneath the flow of thoughts and stories, to allow the deeper connections to begin to reveal themselves. It is in this way that my anger ceases to be good or bad, right or wrong. I cease to hold tight to it as mine at all, and it can then become a good spiritual friend and teacher. But only if I allow it to be so, by learning to experience it. If I fail to do so, the result is violence. There is an intimate connection between anger, violence, and our shared vulnerability. The experience of anger forces us back to our actual mutual necessity and interconnection, and so to our infinite vulnerability with each other. Our violence, whether the sharp word or the knife or the gun, in attempting to turn away the potential shame of that exposure to each other, instead only confirms it. Our society, which does so much to celebrate and elevate our actual inequality and engage us in perpetual competition, both programs and compounds this sense of fearful vulnerability. In our moments of relationship, we can nevertheless come to experience the joyful vulnerability that is the precondition of our self-sense of mutuality and connection. We do this in our caring about, our caring for, and our receiving care. Relationship is never without risk and rarely without rupture. It's the reality of not knowing. It is the deep joy of our being not separate.